Hi everyone, and welcome to our final week, where the big question is how history causes genocide. As usual, here are our discussion points. We'd be forgiven for thinking that history is a good thing. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Those words are written in stone at Auschwitz today, where we can also find this familiar slogan, never again. And to a certain extent, history is part of the solution. But the argument this week is that this same rhetoric is deeply implicated in the problems of genocide. So how does history cause genocide? There's two ways of looking at it. Empirically, we can see the so-called repeat offender effect. Past violence left unpunished creates a permissive environment in which people become habituated to atrocity, feeding into escalatory cycles of violence. It's not surprising to see serial genocides in the same place, like how the wave of pogroms in 1919 Poland and Ukraine foreshadowed the Holocaust, for example, or how the 1994 genocide in Rwanda was preceded in the 1970s by a genocide in neighboring Burundi. The point is that past genocides is a risk factor for future genocides. Another way we can see history as a cause of genocide is with the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, who tragically committed suicide trying to escape the Nazis. Come back later and read my notes on Benjamin's metaphorical angel of history, who was fighting for survival in the storm we call progress. We've seen this before, the keyword progress, at the center of the meta-narrative of modernity. How has this idea justified genocide? What are some of the supposedly inexorable laws of history? In other words, the international system is a root cause of modern genocide. Picking up on the empirical observation from before, Levine's multi-volume historiography identifies certain zones of genocide, or specific geopolitical hotspots where genocide or near-genocidal events periodically flare up over time, given the right conditions. Theoretically, the argument is that the modern form of the nation-state has a built-in risk for genocide, given its propensity for homogeneity. This argument is based on what international relations, or IR theory, calls the levels of analysis problem, in which individual countries at the units level of analysis are distinguished from the international system that operates at an overarching level. For Levine, the etiology of genocide doesn't stem from variation at the units level of analysis, or what IR theory refers to as endogenic causes. As far as genocide is concerned, such an approach reflects the problematic tendency to simply blame genocide on quote-unquote bad regimes. But Levine doesn't think it's a problem of bad apples, per se. Rather, his argument is that the problem is with the apple barrel. That is to say, genocide stems from exogenic causes that are built into the international system itself. How exactly is genocide hardwired into the international system? Let's start by defining some critical terminology from IR theory. Sovereignty refers to a state's absolute control within a territorial jurisdiction. Theoretically, anything that goes on inside those boundaries falls under the prerogative of the sovereign. As the comedian Eddie Izzard said, the world is apparently fine with countries committing genocide against their own people. It's when it spills over that it's a problem. For evidence, consider the fact that the Nuremberg trial specifically precluded the pre-war persecution of German Jews from 1933 to 1939. Stated differently, if the Nazis had stopped in 1939 and World War II had never happened, it's very likely that the persecution of German Jews would have been swept under the rug. So how do states get away with this? It's because the international system is anarchical, meaning there's no higher authority. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there in the realm of international relations, a Hobbesian state of nature where the threat of war is constant. The international system produces a security dilemma, where increased security measures paradoxically leads to greater insecurity. This is the permissive environment that allows for genocide. The security dilemma is compounded when you factor in the social-psychological variable of trauma. Originally, the concept of trauma was used on an individual level to explain personal experiences relating present suffering to past violence, but it's since been expanded to the collective level with notions of cultural or historical trauma. Dirk Moses' premise in Reading 2 is that unresolved trauma is dangerous. Elsewhere, he builds off the work of literary scholar Dominic LaCapra, who has written about how victim groups identify themselves with a certain fidelity to trauma. This idea also relates to what we've read about humiliation, or the nuclear bomb of emotions. Finally, recent work in terrorism studies also shows that collective trauma and grievances are a common factor in the radicalization process. Now, reading 2 is theoretically a bit dense, not to mention controversial, given its stance on Israel-Palestine. So, just work through the intro, skim the body section, and pick up closely again towards the end, especially on this page, where Moses begins developing his critique of what we can call the competitive memory model, in which public recognition of trauma is a zero-sum competition. The operative metaphor is the real estate model, so that as one party gains, others necessarily lose. Instead, Moses is moving towards an alternative approach to memory, which elsewhere is called the multidirectional memory model. Here the operative metaphor is building bridges. What does Moses have to say about the Palestinian-American literary scholar Edward Said, about the organic connection between Jewish and Palestinian experiences? Israel-Palestine is perhaps the quintessential case of an intractable conflict, a concept which is defined in Reading 3 by Israeli psychologist Daniel Bar Tal. Again, note the zero-sum nature of this. How does the instrumentalization of collective memory factor into Bar Tal's argument? How does this idea relate to earlier concepts and theories, such as social identity theory and the victim-perpetrator paradox? Finally, this work is a good example of a related body of scholarship from peace and conflict studies, which is geared towards highlighting the best practices for achieving reconciliation. Finally, we arrive at Reading 4, our last reading of the semester. What is the terror of history? This idea fits into the theoretical argument introduced earlier. We already saw Walter Benjamin's position on this, which we'll see again in this reading. He was arguing against Hegel's idea of history as a quote-unquote slaughter bench of peoples, or the idea that the march of civilization and progress invariably left destruction in its wake. For this early 20th century Romanian fascist, the man who coined the phrase, the terror of history, this annihilation anxiety, this fear of being written out of history, was an animating force in the political imaginary of genocide. Moses' argument stresses the danger of politics becoming what he calls calamitized, or filtered through the lens of unresolved trauma, so that any crisis in the present is depicted as a reincarnation of past sufferings. Recall his earlier point about the instrumentalization of collective memory, and how that fits into Daniel Bar Tal's framework. The danger is that this feeds into a competitive zero-sum logic that contributes to intractable conflicts and perverse public debates cast in terms of, my trauma is bigger than your trauma, all of which potentially feeds into an escalatory dynamic of extremism. Thus, we return to Strauss's point from last week, when a sense of preemptive security becomes logical. This is what Mark Levine calls the perpetrator's never again syndrome. Thus, we end on this disconcerting note. The slogan never again may inspire the public good of history, but like many of the things we take for granted as ostensibly good and normal, there's a dark side as well. In sum, we should be wary of the risk factors around us. Okay, and that's it. We have our usual weekly assignments, plus you have your historiographical essay due. Note the extended deadline. In closing, let me thank you all for a wonderful semester. If you ever want to talk about any of this stuff, please do drop me a line. So anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.